Welcome to The Whole Itself Remains. I'm your host, Todd Caldecott, and you're listening to CJMP Co-op Radio 90.1 FM, broadcasting from the Cassette region on the beautiful Sunshine Coast of British Columbia on the traditional territory of the Common People. The show is also available on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform. So on the heels of my recent clinical seminar on aging and longevity, which you can still enroll in on my school website at dogwoodbotanical.com, today I want to review the so-called NAD+ boosters, a derivative of the B vitamin niacin, vitamin B3, which is being marketed in some cases rather aggressively as an anti-aging supplement. Following this, I'll be joined by renowned herbalist and elder statesman of North American herbalism, David Winston, for a wide-ranging conversation on the meaning of holism in medicine and life. So I'm sure you've come across these NAD+ boosters. They're all over social media, being touted as an anti-aging supplement to enhance longevity. And I think it's important here to separate the signal from the noise to see if they're really as valid as people say they are, and if there really should be any cautions that we should be looking at. So when we talk about these NAD+ boosters, what we're really talking about are metabolites of niacin. So the story begins with niacin. And the story of niacin itself, it's really interesting. It begins with the story of pellagra. This is an awful disease that swept through the American South at the turn of the last century. It is characterized by the so-called 4 Ds. It begins with a dermatitis, a skin rash, that then progresses to a diarrhea, which causes nutritional malabsorption, then moves on to causing dementia, i.e. neuronal degeneration in the brain, and then finally ends up with death, the 4 Ds. As I said, it was an awful condition and affected primarily poor people. And the public health officials at the time, they had no idea what was causing it. They quarantined people while they madly searched for some type of cause. They thought it might be bacterial or maybe it was parasitic. But it wasn't until 1914, public health physician Joseph Goldberger, he decided to feed these quarantined people a diet rich in meat, milk, and yeast. And within a short period of time, he essentially cured them of their pellagra. Now, he didn't know what it was in the food that was promoting this benefit, but he called it pellagra preventing factor. Now, it just so happens that this pellagra preventing factor had been discovered decades before by the chemist Hugo Weidel in 1873, synthesized from nicotine. Later in the 1930s, another chemist named Conrad Elvehjem isolated this pellagra preventing factor from liver, and he fed it to dogs that had been experimentally induced to have pellagra by feeding them a low-protein, corn-based diet. And supplementing their diet with this pellagra preventing factor, i.e. niacin, he cured their pellagra. So in short order, within a few years, niacin had been introduced into the food supply. It was then used to fortify flours, corn flour, etc., and essentially pellagra was gone. Now, even though it's a fascinating tale about scientific discovery, it's also an important cultural lesson, because corn itself comes from Central America, where it's been consumed by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, seemingly without ever causing pellagra. Why is this? Well, the indigenous peoples were very clever. They figured out a way to make the corn more digestible through a process that we now call nixtamalization. Essentially, what this involves is taking a vat, filling it with water, and then adding to it the ashes of a wood fire that make it very alkaline. They then put the dried corn in there, and then they cook it very slowly. And what this does in this highly alkaline solution is it breaks down the corn fiber and it releases stored nutrients, including amino acids, and in this case, most importantly, niacin. So then they never had a problem with pellagra. But when corn was introduced to the American South, because it was a new food, they never brought with it the traditional practice of nixtamalization. Essentially, the disease of pellagra was an artifact of not observing these traditional methods of food processing, which we also see today with celiac disease. If you look at the signs and symptoms of celiac disease, they are remarkably similar to that of pellagra. Very, very similar. This is not to say that people haven't experienced it in the past, but as the widespread phenomena that we see now, it's a relatively modern condition. And this is because of changes that have been made to the food supply, specifically the way we process and prepare bread. So for thousands of years, whenever people were eating bread, it was always made with a sourdough. Typically, the dough would be fermented for 2 or 3 days, and then when baked, the bread was so crumbly there wasn't any gluten left, meaning that the gluten had been broken down, hydrolyzed into harmless amino acids. But of course, that doesn't look like bread nowadays. Most bread these days is a yeast-risen bread that doesn't undergo this traditional method of fermentation, and therefore all of the gluten remains intact. And we now know there is clinical evidence that if you ferment bread correctly over a long period of time, over a 3-day period, it completely hydrolyzes all of the gluten, and you can even feed it to patients with celiac disease, and it does not elicit any clinical symptoms of celiac disease. So just like pellagra, celiac disease is an artifact of a failure to observe these traditional methods of food processing. Okay, so this sets the story for niacin, but we're talking about NAD+, which is a derivative or metabolite of niacin. So let's talk about that. So NAD+ was actually discovered in 1906 by 2 chemists, Hardin and Young. They found that yeast fermentation required something called a coenzymase, something that they discovered. They didn't know what it was, but it was isolated again in the 1930s by German chemist Otto Warburg, who told us that sugar feeds cancer. I'll talk about this in a second. That identified NAD+ as a super important molecule that can shuttle electrons back and forth across membranes within the mitochondria of the cell, generating energy. And as I mentioned, Otto Warburg is famous because he discovered that cancer cells have dysfunctional mitochondria, and therefore those cells have to rely on what are called glycolytic mechanisms, primitive mechanisms to break down sugar and release energy and lactate in the process. Likewise, relying on NAD+ to maintain their growth and survival. And this is important because NAD+ is neutral. In different contexts, it can be both good and also quite bad. So is it something that we should be supplementing for? Now, niacin is different. Niacin is important. Without niacin, we can't produce NAD+. We all need it. It's an essential nutrient. And apart from its metabolic uses, it also has some other applications too. In the 1950s, a physician named Abram Hoffer discovered that schizophrenics have a blunted skin response to niacin. Like when you take niacin, you'll get a flushing response. Most people will get that, but schizophrenics, he observed, weren't getting it. And he theorized that it was because of some failure of NAD+, specifically being able to transform adrenochrome, what he thought was a hallucinogenic molecule, back to adrenaline. Now, regardless, even if his ideas didn't exactly make sense, or at least can't be supported by the science, him giving schizophrenic patients niacin actually ended up promoting a significant clinical improvement, not just in mood and cognition, but it helped to resolve their constant hallucinations. But beyond its mental health benefits and metabolic benefits, this NAD+ molecule is also interesting from the perspective of longevity. So NAD+ fuels something called sirtuins, which are engaged in cellular repair and metabolism, as well as PARPs, which engage in DNA repair, and then these immune and calcium signaling enzymes on the surface of cells that play an important role in regulating the immune response, CD38 and CD157. And as we age, NAD+ levels decline because these enzymes consume it faster. They're hungrier for it. And the body can't keep up and replace it. And so over time, this dynamic of inflammation overwhelms the cell because of this apparent NAD+ deficiency. And this is where the supplementation comes into play. So there are 2 basic supplements, precursors of NAD+, besides niacin. And they are nicotinamide riboside, or NR, and nicotinamide mononucleotide. So they're all in the same biosynthetic pathway for the production of NAD+. NR is a little earlier and it's more stable. It's not quite as potent, but it's found in food. It's easy to get. It's not so expensive. And then one step closer to NAD+ is NMN, the nicotinamide mononucleotide. It's very expensive and quite unstable, but it will dramatically increase NAD+ levels very quickly. But as I said, it's very expensive. So on a cost basis, it makes more sense to supplement with the nicotinamide riboside, or the NR. However, as I said, I referred to Otto Warburg. Remember, he observed those cancer cells were using NAD+ to engage in growth and repair. So we don't really know about the long-term safety of taking these NAD+ boosters. all of the research is focused on short-term application, where the levels of NAD plus can be measured, but in terms of actual clinical benefits, significant benefits, we haven't really seen them. And moreover, long-term studies have not been undertaken. So we don't know if this is safe. We know the body needs it, but we know that cancer cells also need it and use it too. So that means probably you don't want to be taking these NAD plus boosters if you are an active cancer patient or if you have an increased risk of cancer. Even then, I think it's much safer to take niacin or niacinamide, both of which have lots of different applications to help correct issues like dyslipidemia, to prevent nutrient deficiencies, and its application in mental health issues such as schizophrenia. Next up, my interview with David Winston. So David Winston is a herbalist and ethnobotanist with 56 years of training in Chinese, Western, eclectic, and Southeastern herbal traditions. He's been in clinical practice for 49 years and is Dean of David Winston's Center for Herbal Studies. He is a founding member of the American Herbalists Guild and on the advisory boards of the American Botanical Council, the Botanical Safety Handbook, and the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia. He is also the primary author of the best-selling book, Adaptogens, Herbs for Strength, Stamina, and Stress Relief. Thank you so much for agreeing to sit down with me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Knowing you, it's going to be an interesting conversation.
Well, I hope so. I hope so.
Although
So,
I have no idea what we're talking about, but that's okay.
well, we kind of have it open-ended here, although there is a bit of a theme to this season. The show itself, the whole itself remains, is dedicated to the subject of holism. So expanding beyond just herbal medicine. And I think herbalists are wonderfully suited to examine this issue of holism and how to apply it in practical ways. And you're so accomplished in many different areas. You're, of course, a highly esteemed herbalist, but you also are a practitioner and you have a background that extends beyond just those boundaries. And so one of the things I'm asking folks this season is, what is your understanding and perspective on holism? Like, what does it mean to you when you talk about holism?
Well, that is, it sounds like a very simple question. I don't think it is a simple question at all. I think it's a really complex question because holism is complex by its very nature.
Mhm,
So if we go back to I believe it was the early 1970s, and there was a diagram created that supposedly represented holistic medicine.
mm,
And it was a diagram of three interlocking circles stacked one on top of the other.
mhm,
And that was the sort of representation of holism being the body, mind, and spirit.
mhm,
And when I was learning about herbal medicine, I was given a different model. And so my uncle, he used to talk about how, in looking at that model, that perceived that holism ended with the individual. And of
mhm,
course, that idea, at least in many cultures and in many traditions, is kind of seen as exceedingly limited. So let's take that initial one circle, body, mind, and spirit,
mhm,
three circles, and then put another circle around them.
mhm.
And that circle's family. And then let's put another circle around all of that. And that circle would be community.
Okay.
Then we put another circle, except that this circle has no end and no boundary, so you don't actually draw it. And that is whatever you want to call it: God, spirit, nature, whatever terminology you want to use, and however you want to perceive it. The whole idea of holism is, yes, we as individuals have a body, mind, and spirit, which are all intimately linked. And the idea that you could separate one from the other, the idea that any disease, for instance, is purely physiological or
Mm,
purely psychological, and doesn't have some greater component, I think, again, is a very, very limited view. But the idea that we are connected to our families. So many people, for instance, I've read statistics that someone who grows up in a household where one of their parents is chronically depressed or anxious has about a 50% chance of being depressed or anxious. Now, you could say that maybe it's genetic, possibly, or
mm,
possibly it is a learned behavior because as a very young child, you have no idea what is normal behavior, what are
Right.
healthy coping skills. So you absorb this. We absorb everything. We're like sponges when we're young children. And so
Yeah.
whatever we are exposed to becomes part of our reality. So we are affected by the people around us. And by the way, that same study suggested that if you have two parents who are chronically depressed, anxious, or depressed or anxious, you have about a 100% chance of being depressed or anxious. And so that's number one. But then let's take, so family. Let's say you're in a relationship that is with somebody who's chronically depressed or anxious. Well, the chances of you becoming depressed or anxious skyrocket because depression and anxiety are contagious. And
Okay.
so, therefore, we are not separate from our environment. And when we say this, and when we look at, for instance, traditional Chinese medicine, and you hear about, external evil, external pernicious influences, whether it be heat or wind or dampness or dryness or cold, those are seen as external environmental things, but we are affected by that.
Mhm.
So if you live in an area that has, like Scotland, and it's really cold and damp a lot of the time, and the number of people who have cold, damp arthralgias in that environment is much higher than someplace if you're living in Phoenix, Arizona.
Mhm.
If you are in a place that has, for instance, Syracuse, New York, and parts of the Pacific Northwest, where they have sometimes, 4, 5, 6 months where you virtually don't see the sun, that affects us. We all know about seasonal affective disorder. And
Mhm.
so there are so many ways that we are affected by our environment. Um, so we are affected by our family. We are affected by our community, whether we live in a healthy community, because humans, in the dominant culture, there is this tendency to think that we are individuals. And from my perspective, the Western concept of individuality is a disease in itself.
Hmm.
And it is incredibly unhealthy. This whole idea in the American mythos, anyway, there's this whole idea, that you're supposed to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
Mm.
Well, if you actually go back and look at the origin of that saying, it was actually originally created to sort of say this is something that's impossible. Pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps was an impossibility. So it was a statement of irony, the fact that you think that you could do it by yourself. And
Right.
we have taken this statement, which was originally seen as sarcasm, and made it our reality. But the reality is no one pulls themselves up by their own bootstraps. We are part of something greater than ourselves. And whether that something greater than ourselves is functional and healthy or dysfunctional and unhealthy, that's a whole nother story. But we are a part of something. And then you can take that to a whole nother level. There are people who have coined the term, I'm sure it was a person, but I don't know their name. They coined the term nature deficit disorder.
Okay.
And human beings, we evolved in a green, for the most part, in a green world, not enclosed in four walls, not with artificial lighting. We certainly know, you talk to anybody who works in an emergency room, and at the full moon, admissions go up. We are affected by lunar cycles. We are affected by weather. We are affected by the cycles of nature. I think that there is a part of this whole idea of seasonal affective disorder that is partially has something to do with the way we live in the world we live in. We sort of treat winter as like it's no different than any other time. We just dress more warmly.
Yeah.
When the reality is the world around us is changing. Everything is slowing down, even on a molecular level, which is, of course, why water freezes and turns into ice. And the hubris that we have to think that we are separate from that, we are not affected by that. Of course, many animals go south for the winter, other ones hibernate or become less active. And the fact that we, with our artificial heat and our artificial lighting, kind of just blithely go ahead in our lives thinking that, that's happening out there. In here, nothing's happening.
Mm,
I would beg to differ and say that a lot is happening.
right.
And not just on the level of, yeah, if you get together with a bunch of other people, there's cold and flu season. So that's certainly a phenomenon.
Mhm,
But on a deeper level, both on an emotional level, on a physiological level, things are occurring. And so the fact that we have divorced ourselves from nature doesn't mean, even though we've done it here,
mhm,
doesn't mean we've done it here. We are still affected by the world around us. And for those people, again, whether you believe in a higher power, and again, whatever name you want to give that higher power, or you just call it the Gaia hypothesis and see the earth as a living being, or even nature. Studies have shown that spending time in nature as little as 20 minutes twice a week. So that can be in a park, in a garden, in woods, Japanese forest bathing, makes you more resistant to both depression and anxiety. And of course, I keep going back to those because those are things that are both have become almost ubiquitous,
mm,
especially, I mean, they've always existed, but certainly since COVID have become much more prevalent
mm,
and that people are heir to. And we have a tendency to think that it is because of some sort of, internal defect. We're not strong enough. We're not balanced enough. We've got our demons that we haven't dealt with. And that may all be true, but it is also because we have become disconnected from the real world. We have become disconnected from something that lifts us up outside of ourselves, which is the whole reason for ceremony and ritual. You
mm.
can sit there and say, well, this commemorates, someone's deliverance from, persecution or whatever, all good and fine. But if we look at most traditional cultures, the ceremonies that they have are not commemorating necessarily a specific person or a specific event. They
Mm,
relate to the natural cycles of the world,
mhm,
solstices and equinoxes and dusk and dawn and full moon and dark moon and
mhm.
harvest and planting, fertility. They represent the natural cycles of life. And again, even though we may think that those things no longer affect us, I would say that's wrong.
Right. So you speak to this disease of individualism and the importance of finding this connection and its connection to the seasons and to natural cycles and to express that connection through ritual and ceremony. But I'm wondering for you personally, because I know you, I would like you to speak to your own background. Maybe in this reply you can let us know or give us more detail on that. But you're also a Western person, you live in this culture. So was there some kind of an epiphany or experience that you had that kind of woke you up to this principle of holism, or was it something that was just an expression of sort of a natural inclination?
I don't want to go into it too deeply, but let's just say it actually has a lot to do. Well, there's several things. I'll tell you a few stories.
Okay.
So first off, it has to do with family connections. It
Hmm.
has to do with an uncle of mine and an aunt of mine who were from North Carolina. Um, and it's part of their cultural milieu, which I am sort of distantly related to. So that's part of it. But even at a very young age, before I met any of those relatives, when I was born with severe visual handicaps. In fact, I was basically functionally blind until I had my first eye surgery at 18 months. I had my second surgery at 3 years, my third surgery when I was 5.
Right.
My earliest memory And this is a very clear memory because until then, I really didn't see anything. My earliest memory is at 18 months, which is very early to have a memory, is coming home from the hospital. And after I don't know how many days, they removed the bandages from my eyes. And all of a sudden, I could see everything. And I can remember making my mother carry me around the house, opening up like every drawer, every cupboard, every closet, because it was all new to me.
Hmm.
And so I've always felt that my perception of the world is a little bit different than I think many people's perception of the world. I mean, I don't know that's true. I just think it's true based on what I hear people talk about.
Hmm.
If I was younger, I'm old enough that when I was young, there was no such thing as ADHD or
Hmm.
dyslexia. They just thought I was slow.
Yeah.
And so, but I would have been diagnosed as both, and maybe a few other things on top of that. I'm certainly, I suppose, what they call neurodivergent.
Hmm.
Um, and so, as a young child, I had very poor hand-eye coordination. My hand-eye coordination is still not what it is for most people, but it's better. So I had very poor hand-eye coordination. So like I couldn't play sports with the other boys. And so, and I was also very short. I was very withdrawn. And I was the kid that the local bully, I had a little sign on my back that said, kick me, beat me up, steal my lunch money, pretty much.
Hmm.
And that's pretty much what happened. And so if I had played with other kids, it was mostly girls because they were nice to me and
Hmm.
they wouldn't beat me up. But I spent most of my time in the woods
Hmm.
and I had my favorite tree and I would talk to the tree. Another early memory, I don't quite know how old I was, maybe 4, maybe could have been 5. And I'm out in the yard and I've got this plastic red wash bucket
Hmm.
and I'm picking these leaves, but it's just one plant that I'm picking.
Hmm.
And I'm picking all these leaves and putting them in the bucket, and then I'm putting a little water in there and mashing them up. And my mother comes out and looks at me rather horrified because I suspect I'm covered with this stuff. I don't
Hmm.
remember that, but I'm sure I'm smashing it. I'm sure I had it all over me. And she looks at me and she goes, "What are you doing?" And I told her, "Oh, I'm making medicine. This is for when you get like a boo-boo, when you get, hurt." The plant was plantain.
Uh-huh.
Nobody told me this. The plant told me this.
Interesting.
My earliest friends, much more than humans, were plants,
Huh.
but also not just plants, rocks. I spent months making stone circles around my house.
Hmm.
I carried stones in my pocket. I kept them in my mouth. I had them in my bed. I had them all over my room. Um, And I never thought that, I always thought that stones and plants were just as alive as animals.
Hmm.
And they were sort of my companions as a young child.
Hmm.
And that idea, that it's not even an idea, that reality has never changed for me.
Hmm.
The fact that I eventually found out that I had relatives that had sort of similar ideas, that just was like, oh, okay, I belong someplace. Meaning, those ideas were there, and I was, as I said before, as a child, I was really quite withdrawn, and my experience as a young child was mostly people were good for hurting you. So therefore, as I said, I was quite withdrawn. I was incredibly shy, um, but they never let me down. The
Huh.
plants never let me down. The rocks didn't let me down. They would teach me things to the point, and you may have heard me tell this story before. Now we're jumping decades and decades ahead, but my uncle, who was a traditional healer, he wasn't really, I mean, he knew plants, but I wouldn't call him an herbalist exactly. Uh, my aunt was an herbalist, and she lived in a place called Tuti, Snowbird Indian Community in North Carolina. And so my uncle told me one time if I ever needed to use a plant, I needed medicine for somebody and didn't know what to use, I should sit there and think about the person and just walk through the fields and woods, thinking about the person who needed help. And then the plant would tell me that they could help by waving at me, by, moving. And I thought that was interesting, but I never used it because of my own perhaps ego and things like that. I was like, most of the time I kind of at least some idea of what I wanted to give somebody. At least I thought I did. There were
Mhm.
times I was totally wrong, but at least I thought, more often than not, it's like, yeah, no, they need this. I don't need to do that. So one time I'm down in Churchville, Virginia, teaching for a friend. And it was very, an old country farmhouse, and there was indoor plumbing, but no indoor bathrooms. And
Mhm.
so there was an outhouse. And so it gets morning, I'm going to be teaching later that day. And I wake up, I'm sleeping on the sofa. I'm wearing my t-shirt and pair of underwear, bare feet. And I go out to the outhouse, and I get out to the outhouse because I like really got to go. And there's a sign on it that says out of order. And I'm like, damn. So I'm looking around thinking I'll walk off into the woods because I'm not just going to, right in the yard. And I'm looking around and there's poison ivy like everywhere. And I'm like, I'm pretty sensitive to poison ivy. And while there may be worse places than getting poison ivy on your feet and between your toes, not many. And I'm really like, I need to go. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see this bush and it's waving. And I'm looking at it. And so I walk over there and I'm expecting a bird to fly out, a rabbit, a squirrel, a chipmunk, something, and nothing flies out, nothing moves. And all of a sudden I look down and realize it's the only place there's no poison ivy. So I went in there, I took care of business, and from that moment on, I have believed if you have a need, the plants will respond. So years goes by from that event, and I have a patient who I've been treating for about a year and 3 or 4 months. She came to me, she had glomerular nephritis, chronic autoimmune disease of the kidneys. And when she came to me, her EGFR had dropped down to about 18. And so at this point, she's stage 4 kidney failure. We're talking about, next 6 months, you're probably going to be on dialysis if the drop off continues as it had been going. And I put her on the Romania 6 formula, which is a Lue Diwan, yeah. I put her on the Romania 6 formula, and it's a decent formula. It'll keep people from getting worse for a while. It'll plateau them. So it may work a year and a half if you're lucky, if you're really lucky, 2 years. So I had her on the formula for about a year and 3 or 4 months, and she'd been doing she was stable. She had, her, EGFR and, creatinine and everything had stayed steady. Um, but all of a sudden she came back, from testing and her EGFR had dropped down to 16. If it had dropped at one point, I wouldn't have been as concerned, but I was pretty sure at this point that, the effectiveness of the Romania 6 formula was done. That had been my experience. And so I'm sitting there out by the barn at my old farm, and it's a typical late, that was in New Jersey. It was a late New Jersey summer day, late August. It's 92 degrees, 127% humidity. The air is still, not a breeze to be had. And I'm sitting there and it's hot and I'm in the shade of the barn and I'm thinking about my patient and I'm just feeling really bad because as a clinician, it's one thing if you sit there and say, well, there's nothing more I can come up with, but I'll refer her to so and so because so and so knows more about this than I do, or. And at this point, she had been everywhere and I had nowhere to refer her. And I felt really bad. I felt like I was letting her down. And all of a sudden, I had this big nettles patch over there. And all of a sudden, I look up and the nettles patch is shaking. So I'm a slow learner. So what do I think? I think, oh, is there a bird in there? Is there a squirrel? Is there a rabbit, a chipmunk, etc.? And so again, I stand up and I walk over, expecting fully something's going to run out of there or fly away. Nothing happens. And then all of a sudden in my head, I hear, I can help her. And I'm like, okay. And then I'm looking at the plant. It's late August. The nettle leaves are all bug bit eaten and starting to yellow. They look terrible. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, this is the wrong time of year to gather nettle leaf. And nettle's a fantastic medicine. It truly is.
Mhm.
But it won't treat
Yeah.
glomerular nephritis.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden I hear the seeds, and it's full of seed. The seeds kind of rustle, and I hear, not my leaves, my seeds. At this point, I'm like, so I pick my jaw off the ground, pop it back into place, and I'm like, okay. So I went back to the house. I got some tobacco as a ritual offering, came back to the plant, made an offering, got some gloves on, harvested a whole bunch of nettle seed, and I made a tincture out of it. And it sat a couple weeks till it was ready. I pressed it out and I call up my patient and I said, listen, I've got this thing. It's kind of experimental. I didn't quite tell her how experimental. I said, it's kind of experimental, but if you're interested, I'll give it to you and we'll see what happens. And the one thing, I had never heard of nettle seed being used for medicine for anything, not in any tradition.
Hmm.
The only thing I knew about nettle seed that I had come across was that in Europe during famines, they would grind the seed up and use it for food. So
Right.
I knew it wasn't toxic.
Right.
So that gave me a certain level of comfort. Whether it would do anything for her kidneys was another story. So I give her the nettle seed, and she says to me, "Look, you've helped me as much as anybody has helped me. I'm willing to try it." So I give her the nettle seed, and within 2 months, her EGFR is back to 18. All right, you'll see a little variation. That's not,
Hmm.
that could be a fluke. At 4 months, it's at 20. At 8 months, it's at 22. And at a year, it's at 28. Her nephrologist says to her, what are you doing? She says, oh, I'm seeing this herbalist and he gave me this herb. And he goes like, no, 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 no. I don't want to know about it. Just keep doing it. Which to me is a bizarre response, but nevertheless,
Typical.
yeah. So that nettle seed tincture kept her EGFR between 26 and 28 for 12 years.
Wow.
And when she died 12 years later, it had nothing to do with her kidneys.
Wow.
So that was the first experience with nettle seed. And about 6 months later, I had a second patient with a degenerative kidney disease. And at this point, I've used it for, I don't know, close to 40 years, maybe 35 years, something like that. I've treated humans, dogs, cats who are dying of kidney failure, and it's astonishingly effective. But I learned it from the plant. I didn't learn it from a book. I didn't learn it from another person. I learned it from the plant simply. And it wasn't like, oh my God, I've discovered this amazing thing. No, the plants knew it and they told me. So, this idea that we are separate from these things, that, and we from our Western brilliance can discover everything by killing it and dissecting it, that's
Mm-hmm.
a way of learning. I'm a
Mm-hmm.
huge fan of science.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this goes back to the point of holism, my whole career, I have believed in tradition. I have believed the traditional medicine, the art of medicine, the spirit of medicine, and the science of medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And it always, I find it odd that for many people, it's got to be one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
Either it's got to be all be science or it's got to all be sort of, spiritual things, and that somehow these things are separate and disconnected. I don't see it that way at all. I just think that they're different visions of the same thing, different views of the same phenomenon, and different ways of knowing.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's a lot about holism. It's about having different views of things, being able to see things through different lenses, through different colored glasses, however you want to, say it. The idea that we can see things, anytime we are only have one set of glasses,
Mm-hmm.
all right, it may clarify things, but it also condenses things. It makes things smaller. And so I've always believed that, and for me, that's again, as a major part of holism, is to understand that there are multiple ways of experiencing the world, of being in the world, of learning in the world, and then bringing that back, in this case, not only to my life, but to my clinical practice.
It's fascinating. It speaks to that tradition in Ayurveda that talks about the different sources of knowledge of Shruti, which means to listen. It means like a divinely inspired source, and then Smriti, which means to be remembered, which is kind of an iterative process of trial and error and remembering what happened and passing that on. And, the information kind of gets clarified over time. But the true source of knowledge in the tradition is the shruti, is the listening. And you speak to that so eloquently. And I think if there was no other contribution that you have made, and you've made so many, that one has influenced so many herbalists, myself included, that use nettle now. So thank you, and to your spirit guides or to the nettle spirit that was waving at you. And I think you've really addressed some of the fundamental issues, the issue of contradiction that exists, because when you're looking at things from a holistic perspective, you'll arrive at a contradiction. I think most people will. It's like, how do you reconcile these differing points of view? And I'm wondering if you have encountered that, and how do you reconcile those different viewpoints? If you're getting, say, one piece of information from a more of a scientific, objective, we'll say objective perspective, and then a more kind of intuitive or inspired perspective. Do you struggle with that at all, or how do you reconcile that contradiction that can exist?
Well, I guess I don't see it so much as a contradiction, although I'm sure there are moments when I might see it that way. So, for instance, if, and this has never actually happened, or at least not that I can recall, if a scientific study said such and such does this, and either my personal experience or my intuition says that it does the opposite, that would be seemingly contradictory. But what I've mostly see, so when we look at, for instance, like ethnobotany, so traditional use of plants by indigenous people, you will look at one plant, and a lot of these books, like Mormon's, Ethnobotany of North America, or American Ethnobotany, whatever, Native American Ethnobotany is the
Mm,
title of the book. He'll look at one plant and then he'll look at all the different ethnobotanical sources, and they'll have like 50 different uses for one plant.
mhm,
Some of them you'll notice overlap, meaning, five, six, 10 different native nations are using the plant for the same thing. That to me is a little bit like a double blind study. The fact
mm,
that they've all come to the same conclusion that does the exact same thing tells
mhm,
you there's reality to that. On the other hand, you'll find these outliers where these people are using it in this way, but these people over here are using it in an entirely different way. And to me, that might be perceived as a contradiction. But
mhm,
I think some of that has to do with our perception. Meaning, I think the problem is we as human beings, at our very best, have somewhat limited perception of things.
mhm,
And so, therefore, we all have a bias. We all have a belief system. And one of the things that I try to do, and I'm not saying I succeed all the time, but I try really hard, is to maintain an open mind. And a
mhm,
lot of people will give lip service to the idea, but they don't really do it. So
mm,
when things come along to me that I am unsure about or unclear about, I like to try them. And when I say try them, I don't mean do it once. I mean try them over and over again. So going back to the nettle seed, I had treated at least 10 or 12 humans before I told anybody else about nettle seed, because the reality is that when we are looking at empirical data, so when I'll give you another story. I had read someplace that horsetail vinegar was really effective for treating fungal infections. This person was talking about how it was incredible for athlete's foot and everything. And, as a clinician, athlete's foot, it's not a terrible condition, but it's an annoying condition. And it's one that can be really hard to get rid of, especially people who have long-term athlete's foot. So I was very excited about this because going back into, for instance, Cherokee ethnobotany, there is a history of using horsetail as a douche for vaginal candidiasis. So, again, this is kind of an antifungal thing. So I thought, maybe there's something to this. And I treated two people, two patients, and both cases, the athlete's foot that they had cleared up really quickly and really well.
Was that topically or internally or both?
Topically, this is
Oh, okay.
topical. So, and I have this rule that I have for myself is that I have to see something enough times to know it's not chance, to know it's not
Mhm,
placebo,
mhm,
so I want to see something can work 10 times, 15 times, 20 times and work more off, most of the time before I will start sharing it with other people, before I have a certain level of, what to me is evidence and a sense that there's something really happening here. And I broke my rule. And I remember starting telling people, oh, because I was just super excited about it, telling all these people about it. Well, then my third patient came along with athlete's foot and I tried it and it failed miserably. But still, 2 out of 3, that's good.
mm,
Then the fourth person came along, didn't work at all. 2 out of 4, well, it's still better than placebo. The next 8 people that came along, so now, two out of 2 is really impressive,
mhm,
but an N of 2, so a total study size of 2 is
mhm,
not a very significant study size. And the next 8 people, it failed miserably. And so it just reminded me to be patient and to really, keep an open mind. And so there were, back when I was first studying herbal medicine, um, at the time, I was also really interested in homeopathy. And I didn't understand homeopathy. And I had the good fortune of being invited to go into the last of the great New York homeopaths, Dr. John Stevenson. He let me come into his office and watch intakes for months.
wow,
And it was fascinating. So one day he turns to me and says, so, you want to be a homeopath or an herbalist? And I said, well, I think I would like to do both. And he just shook his head and he says, if you do what I do for the next 20 years, you'll be competent. That voice was like, oh, okay. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that was his perception. I mean, somebody would walk in the room and he'd go sulfur 30 under his breath. And the next thing you know, after an hour plus intake, it would be sulfur 30. He was rather remarkable. But I still, to this day, don't know whether I believe in homeopathy.
mm,
It's interesting with herbs. I almost always I'll use a baseball analogy. With herbs, sometimes it's a sacrifice bunt, sometimes a single, a double, a triple, sometimes a home run, sometimes a grand slam. Herbs, I always get some movement.
mm,
With
mhm,
homeopathy, it's like a strikeout or a grand slam and almost like nothing in between. So that's again my experience. Other people who are probably more knowledgeable about homeopathy than I am, you may have a very different experience. I'm not saying anything beyond the fact that I still can't figure it out.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
there are other things, like in the herbal field, I came across there are people who believe in using herbs at super low doses. Now, I'm
mhm,
not talking about toxic herbs. I'm not talking about gelsemium
mhm,
or veratrum, which are all
mhm,
drop dose herbs, or
mhm,
even, phytolacca poke, which
mhm,
are low dose herbs. I'm talking about using herbs like chickweed, 3 drops 3 times a day.
yes,
And I first came across that, and internally I thought, that's not going to work.
mhm,
But I try to stay open minded.
mhm,
Even if I'm not convinced it's going to work, I want to learn.
mhm,
And as a clinician, the greatest gift you can give to your patients, in addition to whatever knowledge you hold, is to listen, number one.
mhm,
And number two, to stay open minded.
right,
And so I decided to give it a try in my practice. And I had some patients that I'd worked with for a long time, and I asked them if they'd be willing to do an experiment, that we were going to start using herbs in a different way. Um, and they were all absolutely up for it. And I tried to do it in a way of openness, meaning I tried not to affect the outcomes by sitting there going, well, I don't think this is going to work. I was absolutely interested. I wanted to know if it would work. I,
mhm,
I
mhm,
no doubt had some skepticism, but, again, try to keep open minded. And what I found was for a very, very small group of people, what I call the deficient boulder vegans, this type of herbal practice was great. And again, these are people who are usually very underweight, very
Hmm.
deficient, very depleted.
Hmm.
For them, using these mild, gentle herbs in really low doses really worked well because these are also often people who kind of fall into the category of what some people call universal reactors. They react
Hmm.
badly to everything. They are oversensitive. They have,
Hmm.
and they'll tell you during your intake, oh yeah, I took this drug, I had this bad response. I took
Hmm.
this herb, I had this bad response. I was in an elevator the other day and somebody had been it with too much perfume 3 days
Hmm.
earlier and it just knocked me down. They'll let you know right in the intake that they are super, super sensitive.
Hmm.
And for people like that, that type of herbal practice I find to be brilliant.
Right.
But for 98% of the population who does not fit into that category, most of the time it simply didn't work.
Yeah.
I mean, I had some people who had some initial positive responses,
Hmm.
but then you keep following them. You can't just look at what happened today, but is it still working next week? Is it still working next month? Is it still working 2 or 3 months from now? And some people would have an initial positive response, but then it would fade away.
Hmm.
So there, it's like giving somebody 5 mils of fresh oat tincture and then saying, "Oh my God, it made me feel so much better." It's like, yeah, that's placebo. It's a remedy that's going to take months to really significantly notice. And so, but again, trying to maintain that openness to experiment with things that I'm unaware of, I'm unsure of, and there's so much stuff in the alternative health community that is, shall we say, has limited evidence of efficacy
Hmm.
that, I'm open to, to trying it. And if it works, that's fantastic. But what I want to see is, does it work over and over and
Hmm.
over and over again, or did it just work for that person?
Hmm.
So going back to the nettle story, the first person I gave it to, it worked for, but I wasn't convinced, and for that person, that's phenomenal.
Hmm.
But will it work for the next person?
Hmm.
And the next person. And so I want to see something that's going to work at least 55 to 70% of the time before I'm really convinced that there's something real there. Because
Hmm.
let's not undervalue the healing potential of the healing relationship between clinician and patient
Yeah.
or placebo or
Hmm.
other things like that, which can be very profound. I want to separate those things out. I mean, for my patient, they don't care if it works, it works. But for me as a clinician, I want to know, is this real
Hmm.
or is this just my imagination or my hopes and dreams, which are all wonderful things, but I don't want to depend on that.
Yeah, it certainly speaks to perception, and I think some of this is culturally conditioned. It reminds me again also in Ayurveda that classification, different types of sort of mental states, sattva, rajas, tamas. Those who are very sattva are highly suggestible, hyper responders. They're the ones who you can suggest, meditating or, changing certain aspects of the lifestyle or simply just believing, and they're like, and I think so. I wonder to what extent you've observed this as a culturally determined phenomenon. Like maybe there's certain populations where you can make a subtle suggestion like that, and you're going to get a good response. First of all, that's the other tricky thing. This is like, will they actually do it? But they will consistently report.
That's a whole other thing.
They'll consistently report back benefit, right? And but it seems to be there of this more the sattvika kind of perspective. They're just highly suggestible in the first place. And our culture, using that spectrum from Ayurveda, is more tamasic, which is I need to see some kind of physical, objective evidence of efficacy. If they presenting with a tumor, it's like we'll just cut that thing out. Like, I don't see how applying some unguent is going to do anything. Where someone who's of more that suggestible mindset, it could possibly work even with 3 drops of chickweed to remove all of the lipomas or something like that, with such I've heard. And I've had some experience with chickweed as well, not drop doses, but some amazing. So, do you think, or has it been your experience that some of this is culturally determined or affected? Or do you think there's just like this like subset in every population, whether they're deficient vegan types or maybe they're devout Hindus or Christians or it sort of seems like this aspect of spiritual elevation is a part of it. They just kind of more tuned into the higher frequency vibrations, let's say.
Right. Well, belief's a powerful thing.
Hmm.
And again, I think we need to separate out the individual patient from the practice. So,
Right.
meaning to the individual patient, it doesn't matter why it worked. All that matters is it worked.
Hmm.
So, your individual patient doesn't care whether it worked because of belief, placebo, healing relationship, or clinically, chemically, it actually had activity. It's immaterial to that person.
Hmm. Hmm.
On the other hand, as I said before, as a clinician, certainly I have a healing relationship with patients I have a long history with. Absolutely.
Hmm.
And I want that to be a positive thing. You can, just like there's a healing relationship, I think there can be an anti-healing relationship. You go to somebody who's got like the bedside manner of some antisocial thing, something very, somebody who has no, who you find offensive and frustrating and
Hmm.
difficult to deal with. I think that that would inhibit that potential healing response in most cases.
Hmm.
Um, but I think that, as a clinician who is interested in understanding my practice and my materia medica and the treatments that I'm using, um, I am very vested in the fact that I want these to work because they actually work.
Hmm.
All right, not dependent on any other factors. So I think that I do believe, and I can't say that I have great levels of experience with every culture around the world. I do not.
Hmm. Hmm.
I certainly have treated people of, every many, every race, every gender,
Hmm.
people of all different socioeconomic groups,
Hmm.
very different cultural groups. And I have people, if you have somebody like, um, some cultures are much more open to herbs. It's
Hmm.
part of their cultural
Yeah.
milieu. It's part of their, whether it's like, oh yeah, my grandma used to use this stuff,
Hmm.
or it's yeah, I grew up with these things,
Hmm.
as opposed to the person who's like, yeah, I've been everywhere else and you're my last, shot, and I don't believe in herbs at all.
Yeah.
I want what I'm doing to work on that person too.
Yes.
Um, so I mean, yeah, I think that if somebody believes in it,
Hmm.
it probably may help a bit, but I don't think that that's the reason in most cases why it's going to work. Because again, I'm not in full-time practice anymore. I still see patients.
Hmm.
Either they're people I've been dealing with them and their families for decades, or I work as a consultant to a lot of physicians, and they'll sometimes ask me to see somebody sort of as a favor, somebody who they're like just shaking their head at, going, "We don't know what to do with this person," which doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily mean I know what to do with the person, but I'll, as a favor, I'll give it a try. And so most of the people I'm seeing are really complex cases.
Hmm.
I'm not seeing people who have BPH. I'm not seeing people with, simple menstrual cramps,
Hmm.
or, I'm seeing people with really complicated, confusing cases in most situations. And these are people who, if it was placebo, it would have worked way back when, because these are not people who they go to the herbalist first. These are
Hmm.
the people who they're coming to you because they have tried everything and
Hmm.
nothing has helped them.
Right.
And so with people like that, they're desperate in most cases, but they also have usually a pretty healthy skepticism about that anything can help them. At this point, they're skeptical about Western medicine. They're
Hmm.
skeptical about alternative medicine, because again, that's a label that is applied to so many things.
Hmm. Hmm.
That encompasses every color and every number. It's
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
and so they tend to be rather skeptical. But, number one, of course, and the beginning of that healing relationship we talked about before, is just sitting there and letting them tell their story, which,
Hmm.
by the way, happens to be a very healing process in itself. Because
Hmm.
most times when patients go to physicians, And this isn't a knock on physicians. And of course, the Canadian healthcare system is set up different than the American one. But the American healthcare system, most doctors at most get to spend 7 to 15 minutes with each patient.
It's about the same here too.
There's just no time for
Mhm.
people. Now, you have to learn as a clinician to sort of steer people where you know to get the information you
Mhm.
need, because some people can go on for hours and hours and hours. And
Yeah.
if you actually have a practice, you just can't do that. But I spend on average an hour with each patient.
Mhm.
And you need to learn to be a good listener, and not just to what they're saying, the tone they're saying it, their body language, all of those things that are giving you information, which is kind of holistic as well, because you're not just depending on one view, the
Mhm.
words, but what is the quality of their words? Sometimes what words do they choose? Sometimes you'll see people repeating certain phrases frequently. Again, you'll watch body language. Oh, how's your relationship? Fine. No, it's not fine. They're gritting their teeth and clenching their jaw, and their voices become atonal. Most definitely, things are not fine.
Mhm.
And as we mentioned earlier, that relationship, whatever it may be, could be one piece for why they are experiencing what they're experiencing. So
Mhm.
this the whole idea that we have to look at the whole person in the context, and this is going to sound overly huge, but we're literally looking at the whole person in the context of the whole world.
Mhm.
And yes, it is really large. I mean, the good news is probably what's going on the other side of the world doesn't affect them, but maybe it does.
Mhm.
Maybe they have family in Palestine.
Yeah.
How wouldn't that affect you? Maybe they are a person of color living in a really racist society. That What is that like? You hear about, the problems here in this country with driving while black. What
Mhm.
about living while black?
Mhm.
And the stress that comes from the fact, or today here in this country, living while Hispanic,
Mhm.
where it doesn't even matter if you're a citizen.
Mhm.
You may get pulled over and disappeared because of an accent, because of how you look.
Mhm.
Though all those things affect us, we are not living in a vacuum. We are affected by the world around us. And so to ignore that, I think misses a significant piece of the individual puzzle that you are dealing with.
Yeah. I so agree. David, I have to wind things up because of time. Thank you so much for taking your time to speak with me today. I really appreciate it.
Todd, an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me on.